The story of Justinian begins not in a palace, but in the rugged, provincial hinterlands of the Eastern Roman Empire. Born around 482 CE in the village of Taurigium, located in the Roman province of Dardania, modern-day North Macedonia, Justinian's birth name was Flavius Petrus Sebaceus. His origins were humble, his family being of Illyro-Roman descent and far removed from the aristocratic elites of Constantinople. Yet, within the framework of the late Roman world, which still allowed for some degree of social mobility, the seeds of greatness found a fertile ground. Justinian's early life was shaped by modest circumstances, but he was not entirely without advantage. His uncle, Justin, had risen through the military ranks to become a member of the Imperial Guard, the Executors, eventually ascending to power as Emperor Justin I in 518 CE. This familial connection would become pivotal for Justinian's future. However, it would be reductive to attribute his rise solely to nepotism. From an early age, Justinian exhibited extraordinary intellect, discipline, and ambition, traits that would later define his reign. Recognizing his nephew's potential, Justin summoned Justinian to Constantinople, the vibrant heart of the Eastern Roman Empire. In the imperial capital, Justinian received an advanced education that covered a classical Roman curriculum: rhetoric, theology, law, and philosophy. This education not only elevated him above many of his peers, but also forged a ruler who could think strategically, communicate persuasively, and legislate with lasting effect. Unlike many emperors who ascended by military strength alone, Justinian blended military support with intellectual authority and legal sophistication. His knowledge of Roman law and theology would serve him throughout his reign, especially in his legislative reforms and religious disputes. Importantly, his education also exposed him to the grandeur of Rome's past, igniting a lifelong aspiration to restore the Roman Empire to its former glory. As his uncle aged, Justinian began to assume greater responsibilities in the administration of the empire. Officially appointed as consul in 521 CE, he increasingly operated as the de facto ruler even before Justin's death. This period allowed him to hone his leadership skills, form political alliances, and establish a reputation for diligence and capability among the empire's elites. Unlike emperors who stumbled upon power, Justinian prepared meticulously for it. While Justinian's rise was bolstered by familial ties, he distinguished himself through personal merit and ambition. His ascent was not merely a transfer of power, but a transformation of imperial ideology. In his vision, the emperor was not only a military and political leader, but a sacred guardian of Christian orthodoxy and Roman legacy. This perspective would define the tone and direction of his rule, often blending religion and politics in unprecedented ways. Justinian's early career also laid the groundwork for some of his most influential relationships, most notably with his future wife, Theodora, who would later become empress. Although she does not take center stage in this chapter, it is important to note that Justinian's openness to elevating individuals based on merit rather than birth reflected a broader shift in the empire's socio-political fabric. This meritocratic inclination began in his own life, a man of peasant stock who would one day rule the most powerful empire of his time. Moreover, the time Justinian spent in Constantinople coincided with a transitional period in the Eastern Roman Empire. While the Western Roman Empire had fallen in 476 CE, the East remained strong, though increasingly defined by its Greek-speaking population and Orthodox Christian identity. Justinian's background as a Latin-speaking provincial outsider may have shaped his determination to reassert the Roman identity of the empire at a time when that identity was being diluted by geographic and cultural change. By the time Justin died in 527 CE, Justinian was the clear successor. His coronation marked the beginning of a reign that would span nearly 4 decades. The empire he inherited was administratively stable, but vulnerable to external threats and internal discord. The challenge ahead would be immense. Yet Justinian entered the role with a deep awareness of its historical weight and divine sanction. In the marble-clad corridors of Constantinople's imperial palace, the presence of Flavius Justinianus grew ever more prominent. He was not yet emperor, but there was an aura about him, a quiet intensity, a calculated grace in his movements, and a confidence that drew the gaze of powerful men and wary bureaucrats alike. The bustling capital, with its clamor of merchants, priests, senators, and soldiers, whispered his name with both curiosity and caution. His rise had not gone unnoticed. The court of Emperor Justin had become Justinian's proving ground. Within its labyrinthine bureaucracy, Justinian navigated the shifting allegiances and rivalries with a sharp mind and unwavering ambition. He was not content to be a shadow behind the throne. He subtly reshaped the palace's machinery to reflect his vision. With every new appointment, every promotion handed to loyal men, every imperial order drafted in his voice, the reins of power slowly migrated into his hands. Justinian's daily life was consumed by governance. He was known to rise before dawn and work deep in the night, meticulously reviewing petitions, drafting legal responses, and absorbing intelligence reports from the empire's distant frontiers. Courtiers who had once dismissed him as a rural upstart began to fear his command of statecraft. He mastered the intricate protocols of court life, but never allowed himself to be seduced by its luxuries. His mind was fixed on loftier goals. Behind the scenes, he began cultivating a circle of talented and loyal individuals. Among them were men who would later become key figures in the empire: administrators, generals, jurists. But perhaps the most surprising of these alliances was with Theodora, a woman whose past was the stuff of rumor and scandal, yet whose intellect, strength, and charisma matched his own. While their marriage would come later, it was in these formative years that their bond began to take shape, challenging the rigid social codes of the time. Beyond the court, the streets of Constantinople were alive with tensions. Factions known as the Blues and Greens, originally rooted in chariot racing, had grown into powerful political and social forces. Their influence extended far beyond the hippodrome. They could sway public opinion, incite riots, and even challenge imperial authority. Justinian, ever the strategist, aligned himself with the Blues, but not blindly. He studied these groups, manipulated them when necessary, and ensured that no faction grew stronger than the state. It was during this pre-imperial period that Justinian began to shape his identity as more than a mere ruler-in-waiting. He portrayed himself as the protector of the Christian faith, a defender of divine order. Though not yet crowned, he issued theological positions and engaged in religious debates with patriarchs and bishops. He understood that legitimacy in the Byzantine world did not rest solely on blood or sword. It was sanctified by divine approval, and Justinian was determined to appear as God's chosen vessel. Amid these developments, the military remained a critical concern. Though he had yet to lead armies himself, Justinian invested time in learning from seasoned generals and veterans of past campaigns. He reviewed maps, studied the logistics of supply chains, and followed the movements of barbarian tribes pressing on the empire's borders. His mind was ever calculating. What was lost in the West could perhaps be reclaimed. By 525 CE, whispers of his coronation had become proclamations. Justinian was named co-emperor, a clear signal that the aging Justin was preparing to pass on the purple. The empire responded with mixed reactions. Many in the Senate questioned his untraditional ascent, while others saw in him the potential for strong, reformist leadership. Among the masses, particularly those aligned with the Blues, there was hope that he would bring order and piety to a city and empire in flux. His preparation for emperorship culminated not in a sudden leap, but in a steady, deliberate assertion of presence. On the day of his official coronation in 527 CE, he wore the imperial robes not as a gift from fate, but as the natural result of tireless effort. The coronation ceremony in the Grand Hagia Sophia, still in its earlier form before his later reconstruction, echoed with chants and incense as Justinian stepped into the role for which he had long been preparing. He did not tremble. He did not hesitate. The empire was now his to mold. In the imperial court, where rank was guarded more jealously than treasure, Theodora stood as an anomaly, an empress whose origins defied every expectation of Byzantine aristocracy. Before she was draped in silk and crowned beside Justinian, she had walked a very different path, one carved through the grime of Constantinople's lower quarters and the fleeting glamour of the stage. It was this unlikely background that would mold a woman of remarkable insight, resilience, and influence. Born around 500 CE, Theodora's early life was tied to the Hippodrome, where her father worked as a bear trainer for the Green faction. When he died, her mother petitioned the Blues to take her husband's place, and so Theodora's life began to shift between these powerful social factions. As a young woman, she became an actress, a profession associated with scandal and often conflated with prostitution. But while others dismissed her as a figure of entertainment, Theodora was absorbing the dynamics of power, influence, and persuasion. Her travels across the eastern provinces, particularly in North Africa, gave her a broad view of the world far beyond Constantinople's imperial circles. She spent time in Alexandria, where she encountered the growing influence of Miaphysitism, a Christian theological belief that would later become central to her religious advocacy. It was there, far from the capital, that Theodora began to develop not only a spiritual identity, but a sense of mission. She returned to Constantinople with something many lacked: a perspective forged in hardship and a voice sharpened by survival. Theodora met Justinian sometime before he ascended the throne, and their bond quickly transcended the norms of courtly decorum. Their relationship, formalized in marriage around 525 CE, shocked the senatorial class, which viewed her as unworthy of an imperial union. But Justinian defied them, and more importantly, he rewrote the law to make it possible. He elevated her not just as a consort, but as an intellectual and political partner, his equal in thought and action. Upon Justinian's coronation, Theodora was crowned Augusta, not as an afterthought, but as an essential pillar of the new regime. She took her seat beside the emperor during official ceremonies, received foreign envoys, and issued decrees under her own name. She was not a figurehead. She was a sovereign in her own right, wielding both formal and informal authority with unmatched poise. Ministers and generals quickly learned that her counsel was not to be ignored. Theodora's role in shaping imperial policy was especially evident in matters of justice and welfare. She championed the rights of women and children in ways no empress had before. Under her influence, laws were enacted to prevent the trafficking of girls, grant more rights to women in divorce, and protect actresses from exploitation. She also supported the creation of safe houses and monasteries for former prostitutes seeking new lives, initiatives that reflected both her personal history and her commitment to reform. Her political acumen shone brightest during moments of crisis. During the infamous Nika riots, when the city burned and the emperor considered fleeing, it was Theodora who famously refused to abandon the throne. Her speech, calm yet resolute, reminded the imperial court that purple was a robe best exchanged only for a burial shroud. Her defiance steadied Justinian and turned the tide of that pivotal moment. In this, she proved that courage was not bound by gender or tradition. It was the core of leadership itself. Religiously, Theodora became a powerful patron of the Miaphysite movement, often in contrast to Justinian's support for Chalcedonian orthodoxy. This divergence did not fracture their partnership. Instead, it added a complexity to the imperial court's religious posture. She financed churches, negotiated with bishops, and offered asylum to Miaphysite clerics. Through these acts, she created a parallel avenue of influence that extended deep into Egypt, Syria, and Armenia, regions vital to the empire's cohesion. Theodora's influence was not universally welcomed. Members of the Senate and aristocracy whispered of her control over the emperor, of her background, of her ambitions. But these murmurs rarely translated into open opposition, for her intelligence was sharp, her network vast, and her command over the palace formidable. She moved through the corridors of power with a mixture of grace and steel, demanding respect where history would have denied it. When she died in 548 CE, Justinian was never quite the same. Her passing marked the end of an era within his reign, a period defined not only by legal codes and wars, but by the presence of a woman who had dared to defy destiny. Theodora left behind no army, no sons to succeed her, no memoirs. It began with a murmur, a low grumble echoing through the streets of Constantinople as citizens spilled from their homes into the alleys and forums, drawn by something more potent than politics: fury. By January of 532 CE, the capital had grown restless. Taxes were crushing, justice was often selective, and the people's loyalty had long been splintered between the two most powerful public factions, the Blues and the Greens. Chariot racing teams in appearance, these groups had morphed into complex social and political machines. Their rivalries no longer stopped at the Hippodrome. The initial spark was not unusual. Two men, one blue, one green, had been sentenced to death for murder following a riot. When their supporters begged the emperor for clemency, only one sentence was commuted. This selective mercy, likely meant as a gesture of compromise, instead became a rallying cry. On the day of the next race, the two factions, historically at odds, did something unheard of: they united. Their combined chant rang through the stone vaults of the Hippodrome like a war cry. Nika, meaning conquer or victory. What followed was not a mere riot, but a siege. The crowd erupted in violence, and within hours, flames consumed buildings near the Hippodrome. The fires spread quickly, engulfing markets, homes, and even sacred structures. The Imperial Guard were overwhelmed, their discipline no match for the surging mob. For days, chaos reigned. The Senate, sensing weakness, began to conspire. A group of aristocrats even attempted to place a new emperor on the throne: Hypatius, a nephew of former Emperor Anastasius, who was seen as a safer, more traditional alternative to Justinian. Justinian, caught between betrayal and rebellion, considered escape. He gathered his closest advisors in the palace, the flames of the city flickering in the horizon beyond the windows. Theodora was among them, silent at first. Then, in a moment that would echo through history, she spoke, not with panic, but with cold clarity. "Royalty is a fine burial shroud," she said, refusing to abandon her post. Her resolve froze the room. There would be no flight. Not tonight. Emboldened by her defiance, Justinian formulated a plan. He would not confront the mob directly, but instead deploy deception and force. Secretly, he bribed the leaders of the Blues to abandon the cause, reminding them of his past support. Simultaneously, he summoned his most trusted generals, Belisarius and Mundus, to surround the Hippodrome while the masses gathered for what they believed would be Hypatius's coronation. The gates of the Hippodrome were closed with the crowd inside. Then, with brutal precision, soldiers stormed the arena. What followed was a massacre. According to contemporary accounts, nearly 30,000 people were slain. Blood soaked the sand where chariots once raced. Hypatius was captured and executed despite having pleaded for his life. The rebellion had been extinguished, but at a terrible cost. The aftermath was surreal. Smoldering ruins lined the streets of Constantinople. Entire neighborhoods had vanished. The city's heartbeat, the markets, the Senate, the churches, fell silent in the face of the purge. Justinian, however, did not waver. He immediately began rebuilding, as if to bury the memory of the riot under new stone and gold. His vision for the capital had always been ambitious, but now it became urgent. It was no coincidence that shortly after the riot, construction began on what would become his architectural crown jewel, the Hagia Sophia. The Nika riots altered the political landscape of the empire. The Senate's power, already in decline, was gutted after its members' involvement in the conspiracy. The urban factions were fractured and pacified through fear. Even the public, exhausted by bloodshed and wary of speaking too boldly, entered a period of relative quiet. Justinian's authority was no longer questioned in the same way. It had been baptized in fire. Yet, the victory came with a shadow. Behind the restored facades of Constantinople lay scars that could not be rebuilt. The city had tasted imperial wrath, and its silence was not only submission, but also mourning. Still, to Justinian, the suppression of the Nika riots marked not the end of a crisis, but the beginning of a new era, one where the emperor, now proven by ordeal, could pursue his grandest ambitions with unchallenged power. From that ash-choked January, a new Constantinople would rise, and with it, the full force of Justinian's imperial dream. But the echo of Nika would never fully vanish from the memory of those who had survived it. It would remain, haunting the stones and alleys, a whispered reminder of how close the empire had come to collapse, and how ruthlessly it had been saved. In the wake of the ashes left by the Nika riots, Justinian, I turned to architecture not merely as a tool of reconstruction, but as an instrument of imperial ideology. Where chaos had reigned, he envisioned order. Where flames had consumed temples and halls, he imagined monuments that would speak of divine glory and imperial permanence. The emperor would not only rebuild his capital, he would transform it into the architectural heart of Christendom, a new Rome that reflected both heavenly splendor and earthly power. The centerpiece of this vision was the Hagia Sophia, which would rise atop the ruins of an earlier basilica destroyed during the riots. Justinian spared no expense. He summoned the empire's most gifted minds, Anthemius of Tralles, a mathematician, and Isidore of Miletus, a physicist. They were not mere architects. They were innovators tasked with engineering the impossible. Justinian did not want a church. He wanted a monument to eternity. The scale and ambition of the Hagia Sophia were without precedent. Its dome, a soaring canopy of masonry and light, was an architectural marvel. Suspended above the central nave as if defying gravity, it became a symbol not just of spiritual ascension, but of the emperor's audacity. Mosaics shimmered in the golden light, depicting angels, saints, and the imperial family. Marble columns from distant provinces, green from Thessaly, purple from Egypt, white from Phrygia, were hauled to the capital, uniting the empire in stone. Construction proceeded with incredible speed. Within 5 years of its conception, the basilica was completed, a feat all the more astonishing given its complexity. When it was finally unveiled in 537 CE, Justinian stood beneath its immense dome and is said to have declared, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee." The Hagia Sophia was more than a church. It was an imperial proclamation in marble and gold, asserting that Constantinople, under Justinian, was the center of the Christian world. Yet the Hagia Sophia was only the beginning. Across Constantinople, the emperor commissioned dozens of projects: churches, monasteries, cisterns, hospitals, and bridges. The Church of the Holy Apostles, once a venerable site of imperial burials, was expanded and embellished. New aqueducts and reservoirs were constructed to improve the city's water supply. Justinian's Constantinople was becoming a fusion of utility and grandeur, functionality wrapped in splendor. Outside the capital, his architectural ambition stretched across provinces. In Ravenna, he left his mark with the Basilica of San Vitale, adorned with mosaics of imperial majesty. Fortresses were restored along the Danube, and roads were repaired throughout Asia Minor and the Levant. Churches arose in Jerusalem, Antioch, and even the Sinai Peninsula. Each structure was a statement of Roman continuity, Christian devotion, and centralized power. Many of these buildings were marked by a distinct style, a fusion of classical Roman engineering with Eastern aesthetics. Domes became a defining feature, set atop square bases with intricate pendentives. Interiors were rich with symbolism, from the acanthus leaves of Corinthian columns to the geometric complexity of floor mosaics. Every architectural decision reflected both political intent and theological meaning. But Justinian's role was not limited to commissioning. He took a personal interest in design, reviewing blueprints, approving materials, and overseeing progress reports. He insisted on perfection and often pushed his architects to innovate beyond known boundaries. While some viewed him as obsessive, others saw in him a rare ruler who did not merely delegate vision, he embodied it. The emperor understood architecture's power to shape perception. A city of soaring domes and gleaming marble was not just impressive, it was persuasive. It testified to divine favor, imperial legitimacy, and cultural superiority. Pilgrims, ambassadors, and merchants who entered Constantinople were greeted not just by walls and markets, but by a vision of an empire that still believed itself eternal. By the time the dust settled, Justinian's Constantinople bore little resemblance to the one he had inherited. It had been reforged in stone and light, a capital worthy of a man who saw himself as both Caesar and servant of God. Among the grand achievements of Justinian I's reign, one stood apart not for its visible grandeur, but for its intellectual depth and enduring influence: the reform of Roman law. While architecture reshaped the skyline and military campaigns redrew borders, it was through law that Justinian sought to define the soul of his empire. He saw legal order not merely as a tool of governance, but as a reflection of divine justice, something to be perfected, preserved, and passed on. The Roman legal tradition, by the 6th century, was in disarray. Over 1,000 years of accumulated decrees, edicts, opinions, and contradictory rulings had created a tangled forest of legal texts. Laws from the time of Augustus jostled uneasily with those of Diocletian and Constantine. Custom, precedent, and imperial whim were often at odds. For ordinary citizens, and even for judges, it had become nearly impossible to know what the law truly was. Justinian recognized the chaos and resolved to impose clarity. In 528 CE, he appointed a commission of jurists led by Tribonian, a brilliant and meticulous legal mind. The task was formidable: to collect, organize, and systematize all existing Roman laws, eliminate contradictions, and present a cohesive body of civil legislation that would be both authoritative and accessible. The result would come to be known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. The process began with the Codex Justinianus, a compilation of existing imperial constitutions and laws. This was more than a simple gathering of texts. It was a selective curation, removing obsolete laws and aligning surviving ones with current imperial ideals. The commission worked swiftly, producing the first version in just over a year. It was an impressive start, but it was only the beginning. Next came the Digest, or Pandex, a far more ambitious endeavor. Here, the team turned to the writings of Rome's greatest legal scholars, Ulpian, Papinian, Gaius, and condensed thousands of legal opinions into a single, coherent framework. This vast compendium, divided into 50 books, formed the intellectual foundation of Roman jurisprudence. The Digest was not meant for the layperson, but for the jurists, lawyers, and judges tasked with interpreting the law across the empire. The third component, the Institutes, served as a textbook for legal students, a distillation of legal principles crafted in accessible Latin. It laid out the basics of civil law, rights, property, contracts, and obligations. For Justinian, the Institutes were a tool for shaping future legal minds, ensuring that the next generation of bureaucrats and magistrates would be fluent in the language of justice. Finally, the Novelli constitutions, or novels, were laws issued after the publication of the Codex. These addressed evolving issues during the latter part of Justinian's reign and reflected his ongoing engagement with governance. Written largely in Greek, they show how the legal culture of the Eastern Roman Empire was shifting toward a more Hellenized form while still grounded in Latin tradition. Justinian's legal reforms were about more than organization. They were ideological. He infused the text with Christian morality, emphasizing the emperor's divine role as the guardian of justice. Laws concerning family, inheritance, and religious conduct were crafted to reflect what he believed to be moral truths. In this sense, law became a mirror of theology, with the emperor positioned as both ruler and interpreter of sacred order. The Corpus Juris Civilis was not widely studied in the West immediately after its creation, but its rediscovery in medieval Europe centuries later would ignite a legal revolution. It became the cornerstone of civil law in continental Europe, influencing legal systems from France and Germany to Latin America. Even in the modern era, echoes of Justinian's codification can be found in constitutions, courtrooms, and legal textbooks around the world. In his lifetime, Justinian may not have fully grasped the long-term impact of his legal work. Yet among all his accomplishments, his wars, his churches, his administrative reforms, it was the law that endured the longest. Through parchment and precedent, his voice traveled beyond the fall of empires. Not merely the lawgiver of Byzantium, Justinian became the architect of legality for civilizations yet unborn. In the halls of military legend, few names shine with the brilliance of Belisarius, the general who carried the weight of Justinian's imperial ambitions across the fractured remains of the old Roman world. Tall, composed, and tactically brilliant, Belisarius was not only the sharpest blade in the emperor's arsenal, but also a symbol of what Rome could still be: disciplined, daring, and devastatingly effective. Through his campaigns, Justinian sought to stitch together the torn fabric of the West, to reforge the unity of empire that time and invasion had unraveled. Belisarius first rose to prominence not on distant battlefields, but within the eastern frontiers. In 530 CE, he faced the Sassanid Persians at the Battle of Dara, a clash that tested both strategy and morale. There, with an outnumbered force, he orchestrated a brilliant defensive victory, employing trench warfare, feigned retreats, and cavalry ambushes. Dara was a triumph not only of arms, but of intellect, and it marked Belisarius as a commander of rare vision. It also gave Justinian a taste of what his general could achieve when given command and trust. But it was in the West that Belisarius would leave his deepest mark. In 533 CE, the emperor sent him to North Africa, a land once held by Rome, but then ruled by the Vandal kingdom under King Gelimer. Many doubted the campaign. Africa was distant, the Vandals powerful, and the sea treacherous. Yet Belisarius, ever composed, landed with precision near Carthage and swiftly advanced. At the Battle of Ad Decimum, he outmaneuvered Gelimer's forces and marched triumphantly into the Vandal capital with minimal bloodshed. The fall of the Vandals stunned the Mediterranean world. Within months, Belisarius had restored Roman control over North Africa, reopened grain routes to Constantinople, and ended a century of Germanic dominance in the region. His conduct and victory was just as impressive. He protected civilians, respected churches, and maintained order, contrasting sharply with the behavior of other conquerors of his age. He was offered a diadem by his own soldiers, an offer he refused without hesitation, sending all spoils and honors directly to Justinian. Flush with success, the emperor dispatched Belisarius again, this time to Italy, where the Ostrogothic kingdom held sway. In 535 CE, the general began his campaign against the Goths, first capturing Sicily, then advancing through Naples, and finally reaching the gates of Rome. There, he defended the Eternal City against an 11-month siege by King Witiges, repelling waves of assaults with strategic brilliance and maintaining Roman control through sheer endurance and ingenuity. The Gothic War, however, would prove a grinding and complex affair. After the siege, Belisarius continued northward, capturing Ravenna and, at one point, being offered the Western crown by the Gothic nobility. Once again, he declined, declaring loyalty to Justinian even as the emperor's envoys began to view him with suspicion. Despite battlefield victories, Belisarius often found his resources limited, his authority questioned, and his movements hampered by Byzantine bureaucracy. His campaigns in Italy dragged on intermittently, marked by shifting alliances, guerrilla resistance, and constant logistical strain. Still, Belisarius fought with unwavering professionalism, maintaining discipline among his troops and winning hearts as well as battles. His ability to govern conquered regions with fairness, to blend clemency with strength, distinguished him from many of his contemporaries. He was not just a tactician, he was a statesman in armor. In later years, he was recalled to the east to once again defend against the Persians, and eventually, In his old age, he was even called upon to protect Constantinople itself from an internal revolt. His loyalty remained unshaken, though his relationship with Justinian grew complex. For all his victories, Belisarius was occasionally sidelined, likely due to courtly jealousy and imperial paranoia. Still, he never betrayed the hand that raised him. Belisarius's career defined the military edge of Justinian's reign, turning imperial dreams into territorial reality. His campaigns, marked by precision, restraint, and humanity, contrasted with the often brutal methods of war seen elsewhere. Though he gained no crown of his own, he earned something rarer: the admiration of allies, enemies, and historians alike. Where Justinian dreamed, Belisarius executed, his sword carving a path for Roman renewal in lands long thought lost. Behind the luminous facades of Constantinople's palaces and cathedrals lay a world far less harmonious, a realm of whispers, ambitions, and calculated betrayals. The Byzantine court, like the empire it governed, was a paradox of divine aspirations and all too human vices. Within its golden walls, courtiers maneuvered like chess pieces, and the greatest dangers to Justinian's rule were not always found on distant battlefields, but within the shadows of his own palace. The court was a hive of factions, each with its own agenda. Senators, generals, clerics, eunuchs, and noble families all vied for influence. Their tools were not only policy and loyalty, but rumor, espionage, and subtle sabotage. A single word in the emperor's ear could make or unmake a career. A single document, altered or forged, could redirect the course of imperial decisions. Justinian, though commanding and decisive, was constantly surrounded by shifting alliances and invisible daggers. One of the most enigmatic figures in these intrigues was John the Cappadocian, Justinian's powerful and unscrupulous Praetorian prefect. Ruthless in his administration of taxation, John enriched the state and himself, while making countless enemies among the aristocracy. His growing power and wealth drew suspicion, and eventually, his downfall came through a web of deceit spun by none other than Theodora, Justinian's empress. She orchestrated his disgrace with surgical precision, demonstrating that in the Byzantine court, intelligence and cruelty could go hand in hand. Theodora herself was a master of courtly manipulation. Though her origins were humble, her political instincts were unmatched. She protected allies with fierce loyalty and eliminated rivals with cold efficiency. It was whispered in court that her gaze alone could unsettle ministers, and her word could alter imperial policy. While Justinian was often absorbed in the law or the affairs of empire, Theodora kept a watchful eye on the people behind the thrones, pulling strings with calculated restraint. Tensions often simmered between civil officials and military commanders. As generals like Belisarius gained glory abroad, they were met with suspicion and resentment at home. Court advisors feared the rise of military strongmen, and more than once, victorious commanders returned from campaigns only to find themselves marginalized. Spies were embedded in armies, letters were intercepted, and promotions were delayed, all part of a silent war to limit the power of those outside the imperial inner circle. Religion, too, became a battlefield for intrigue. The contentious debates between Chalcedonians and Monophysites were not merely theological, they were deeply political. Bishops lobbied the court, bribed officials, and used their influence to shape policy. Doctrinal disputes were weaponized to discredit rivals, and religious affiliations often signaled political loyalties. Justinian had to navigate this treacherous terrain delicately, trying to maintain unity while preserving his own authority. Even within the imperial household, unity was fragile. Trusted advisors sometimes turned traitor, and secret messages passed between chambers late at night. At one point, a conspiracy to overthrow Justinian was uncovered among mid-level officials and minor nobles. Discontent fueled by taxes, centralization, and personal ambition. Though swiftly crushed, it reminded all of the fragility beneath the empire's polished exterior. Foreign ambassadors played their own part in the drama. Ostensibly visiting for diplomacy, many acted as informants, trading secrets for favor and influencing court opinion. Persian envoys stirred unease among generals, while papal emissaries courted theological factions. The imperial court became a crossroads of empire-wide ambitions, a theater where diplomacy, treachery, and theater blended seamlessly. Despite these perils, Justinian maintained control through vigilance and calculated delegation. He relied on a network of informants, secretaries, and legal enforcers. Trials were often held behind closed doors, with sentences rendered before the accused even knew the charges. Exiles, confiscations, and forced retirements became common fates for those who dared overstep. The Byzantine court was a world of masks and mirrors, where loyalty could be feigned, power could vanish overnight, and every triumph bore the shadow of betrayal. For Justinian, survival was not merely a matter of vision or leadership, but of endurance. To rule Byzantium was to walk a razor's edge between greatness and ruin, with only cunning and control keeping the empire and himself from falling into chaos. As the Byzantine Empire basked in the golden glow of territorial reconquest and legislative reform, an invisible enemy crept silently into its heart, unseen, unstoppable, and utterly merciless. Around 541 CE, whispers of a strange and sudden death began to circulate from the ports of Egypt, carried on the sails of grain ships into the great arteries of the empire. Soon, those whispers became cries, and the Justinianic plague cast a long, dark shadow over all that had been rebuilt. The plague reached Constantinople with terrifying speed. It struck without warning. Victims would wake with fevers, feel their lymph nodes swell grotesquely, and die within days. Physicians were baffled, helpless against what modern science would later identify as the Yersinia pestis bacterium. In those days, however, it was interpreted as divine wrath or cosmic misalignment. Neither prayer nor ritual slowed its advance. Bodies piled in the streets. The wailing of the dying became the city's dreadful hymn. The scale of devastation defied comprehension. At its peak, thousands perished daily in the capital alone. Laborers could no longer bury the dead. Mass graves overflowed. Carts of corpses trundled endlessly through silent streets. Justinian himself was struck by the plague, hovering for days on the brink of death. Though he recovered, the empire around him would never fully do the same. The plague did not vanish after a single wave. It returned in cycles, ravaging the population again and again. Provinces lost entire communities. Fields went untilled, cities grew silent, and trade routes were abandoned. With fewer workers, the tax base collapsed. The gears of the imperial bureaucracy ground slowly, struggling to fund the military, repair infrastructure, or enforce law and order. Justinian's ambitious projects, the wars, the legal reforms, the construction, were suddenly weighed down by the reality of demographic and economic ruin. Fear and superstition filled the vacuum. In the countryside, desperate peasants abandoned farms and fled to monasteries or mountains. Urban dwellers turned to apocalyptic prophets. The social fabric began to unravel. Crime surged. Some local governors defied imperial orders, choosing self-preservation over distant loyalty. In this moment of fragility, the once mighty engine of Justinian's vision sputtered under the burden of chaos. External threats exploited the weakness. The Slavs and Avars began pressing the empire's northern frontiers, testing defenses that had once stood firm. In Italy, Gothic resistance reignited. In the east, the Persians sensed opportunity and resumed hostilities. What Justinian had gained through campaigns and legislation now faced disintegration, not by sword alone, but by neglect and overextension. Administratively, emergency measures were enacted. Taxes were adjusted, land was redistributed, and desperate attempts were made to refill the treasury. But the empire's very lifeblood, its people, had been drained. Skilled artisans, seasoned soldiers, competent officials, all had died or disappeared. The emperor's government began relying more heavily on foreign mercenaries and local militias, weakening the cohesion of the imperial military and civil service. Though Justinian remained determined, he ruled now from within a changed empire, one where every decision was marked by limitation rather than possibility. He continued issuing edicts, restructuring cities, and dispatching emissaries, but the spark of confident innovation had dulled into a grim perseverance. His vision for a reborn Roman world now flickered uncertainly beneath the weight of nature's wrath and man's exhaustion. In the shadows of Hagia Sophia, newly built but quieted by loss, the people of Constantinople prayed not for conquest or wealth, but for survival. The empire still stood, but it was diminished, weary, and vulnerable. Justinian had reached for greatness, and for a time, he had touched it. Yet in the end, the course of history was shaped not only by human ambition, but by forces beyond the reach of even an emperor. The plague had become the great equalizer. Emperors and beggars fell side by side, and the monumental achievements of a glorious reign now stood alongside the specter of death and decline. Justinian's Rome had endured many trials, but the shadow cast in this era of pestilence would linger long after his crown grew cold. In the twilight of his life, Justinian sat atop a throne that had weathered glory, upheaval, plague, and war. His hair had whitened, his frame thinned, and his gaze had grown more distant, but the machinery of empire still turned at his command. By the time of his death in 565 CE, he had ruled for nearly 4 decades, a span that reshaped the Eastern Roman Empire and left an imprint so profound it would echo through centuries. Unlike emperors remembered merely for conquests or calamities, Justinian's legacy is layered, woven not only through the lands he sought to reclaim, but into the very fabric of law, architecture, and imperial ideology. His empire, though battered by disaster, bore the deep marks of his ambition. The reign of Justinian was not an age of fleeting victories. It was a crucible of transformation, one that would shape Byzantine identity and influence Western civilization long after the man himself had passed into legend. Among his most enduring contributions was the Corpus Juris Civilis, the codification of Roman law that brought clarity and unity to centuries of scattered statutes and imperial edicts. This legal legacy, preserved and expanded by scholars across continents and eras, would become the bedrock of modern civil law in much of Europe. Through it, Justinian's voice continued to speak long after his own age had vanished, laying down principles of justice, equity, and governance. Equally immortal was the architectural grandeur he left behind, most famously the Hagia Sophia, whose soaring dome seemed to defy gravity and echoed with celestial reverence. Built not just as a church, but as a statement of divine authority, it stood for nearly 1,000 years as the world's largest cathedral and remains one of the greatest architectural achievements in history. Its massive pillars and golden mosaics were more than decorative. They were ideological, a physical embodiment of empire aspiring toward heaven. Justinian's vision of imperial unity, reclaiming the western provinces of Rome and healing religious schisms, was less enduring in its territorial form, yet powerful in symbolism. Though much of the West would fall away again after his death, the idea of a united Christian empire persisted. His model of centralized, sacred kingship became a template not only for future Byzantine emperors, but for rulers from Charlemagne to the Russian Tsars. Even in lands far beyond his reach, Justinian's reign became a reference point. Islamic scholars later studied his laws. Western jurists preserve his codes through turbulent centuries. His name appeared in medieval chronicles as a figure of grandeur and authority, one whose rule exemplified both the glory and fragility of empire. He was a bridge between antiquity and the medieval world, between pagan Rome and Christian Byzantium. Yet the legacy of Justinian was not without shadows. His relentless drive to expand and reform placed immense strain on the empire. The wars exhausted the treasury, the plague hollowed its strength, and his centralization of power created a brittle system vulnerable to shocks. In trying to recapture the past, he may have hastened the erosion of the future. His successors inherited an empire more magnificent, but also more fragile and overextended. Within Byzantium itself, Justinian was remembered with a mixture of awe and ambivalence. The people revered his monuments, prayed in his churches, and lived under the laws he shaped. But they also remembered the taxes, the silence of the plague years, and the court intrigues. His was a reign of extremes, splendor and suffering, order and chaos, hope and devastation. In the centuries to come, poets and historians debated his character. Was he a philosopher king or a ruthless autocrat? A visionary reformer or a man consumed by ambition? The answer, perhaps, lies not in choosing between these portraits, but in accepting their coexistence. Justinian was all of these things. Like the empire he ruled, he was multifaceted, capable of enlightenment and oppression, brilliance and blindness. And so the flame of Justinian's legacy burned on, not as a steady torch, but as a flickering fire across history's canvas. He did not restore Rome in its entirety, nor did he create a utopia, but he dared to reach for the impossible, and in doing so, left behind more than ruins. He left behind an idea. The human will, tempered by law and inspired by the divine, could shape the world anew. That, in the end, may be the truest measure of an emperor.